Hi, everyone, and welcome to every episode of VeggieTales Reviewed. I'm that media guy, and I'm here to answer your questions about the quality of talking Christian vegetable television. Today, we have the subject of Episode 11 Larry Boy and the Rumor Weed. This is the second episode to have our plunger-headed hero as the star, as well as the last Larry Boy episode to air before he got his own series with the Cartoon Adventures of Larry Boy. And honestly, this episode feels more like a backdoor pilot for that series rather than a standalone VeggieTales episode. Or at least it would have felt that way if Big Idea hadn't resorted to Flash animation for that series, but that was a decision made later on due to budget constraints. But yeah, when it comes to traditional VeggieTales staples, there are definitely some core ones that are nowhere to be found. There is no silly song, just like the last Larry Boy episode, but unlike the Fib from Outer Space, this episode does not open with the VeggieTales theme song and countertop segments. There is a truncated version of the Larry Boy theme song, but that only comes after an opening scene that sets the tone for the episode, although it kind of falters on that front, but more on that later. The creators of this episode made that tone-setting choice deliberate, as they wanted it to serve as a warning for the parents who complained about how the last episode scared their kids. And as a kid who was, in fact, petrified by Febrilius Minimus, I can understand the motivation behind that, but, believe it or not, this episode did not scare me at all as a kid. Why was that the case? Well, this is where we get into the meat of things, as this review will largely be a comparison between this Larry Boy adventure and his previous one. If you saw my previous review, which you should totally do, shameless plug, you'll remember that I found that episode to be enjoyable due to it having an impeccable atmosphere through its amped up production values and eerie premise, even though its execution felt a little botched due to its messaging being confusing and the use of the main character being underwhelming. How does this episode address those strengths and weaknesses? Well, let's start by discussing the titular Rumor Weed. Cutting right to the chase here, this character was handled much better than the Fib. For one thing, she actually has an established origin. The Fib came crashing down from outer space because, well, I don't know why. I don't know where the Fib came from, I don't know why it came down to Earth, I don't know why they can seemingly be completely different colors if the ending gag gives us any information. I don't know any of that. The Fib came into existence because the episode simply needed it to exist. In this episode, Larry Boy knocks a potted plant off of the edge of a rooftop, causing it to get in contact with a power line and then fall into the sewers, where it then developed the personality of Joan Rivers. Yeah, it still doesn't make any sense, but at least it is something. I'm not asking for logic in my Talking Vegetables cartoons, but I do ask for setup and payoff, and this episode gives me enough to be satisfied in that regard. Secondly, the way that the problem escalates is also handled much better here. Sure, the Fib growing makes sense if you want to think about how a life figuratively grows, but it becoming a monster that caused havoc in the town didn't make any sense at all considering that the entire town was innocent of the lie. Here, the rumor spreads in the same way that weeds spread and take over vegetation if they are not uprooted, and when Junior and Laura Carrot combated the rumor about how Mr. Alfred is a robot, they solved the root of the problem, and as the nice comments flowed in, the mother weed was killed and the destruction transformed into something that blossomed, just like a flower bed with no weeds and a friendship with no underlying rumors. But what I love most about this episode is that, unlike the previous episode, this episode does not forget that the monster is not the one doing the real damage here. The Fib became 30 feet tall and did damage that Junior was really only tangentially related to at best in his episode. Here, everyone in town gets in on the rumor and damages Alfred's reputation as a result. Everyone really does that. Everyone but the weed. Yeah, despite the weed spreading the rumor, the weed does not add anything to it. When Percy P asks the weed if robots are dangerous, the weed does not say, "Oh yeah, they are out to get you and all of your legume friends." Instead, the weed says, "I don't know, is that what you heard?" When Percy confirms this, she spreads the new info, but that is all she does, spread the word that has already been said. In that way, it does not put the focus of the problem on the weed itself, but on everyone causing the problem, which makes the episode more applicable to real-life scenarios where rumors spread, while still being something fantastical in a way that kids can enjoy what is on display here. However, there are other factors at play here that do affect overall enjoyment, and this is where we get to Larry Boy's involvement in this episode. In case you aren't aware, Larry Boy had no involvement in anything that I just described. He does not spread the rumor, nor does his respect towards Alfred diminish due to the rumor. In fact, Larry Boy isn't even aware of the existence of the rumor until the literal end of the episode. The weed does try to tell him earlier on in the episode, but Larry Boy is willfully ignorant in a way that is supposed to be humorous, I believe. In fact, his lack of impact on the story as a whole seems to be played more for laughs this time around, especially when he tries to deal with the mother weed in the sewer. And while I do appreciate how the episode does try to be more self-aware in that regard, that still does not change the fact that this episode still has the same problem as the last Larry Boy episode, where the plunger-headed hero could be cut out of the episode and nothing would be lost. Again, I get that the problem is meant to be solved by the ones who started it, but still, this episode leaves me perplexed as to why people seemingly have Larry Boy as their favorite character. Not that he's a bad character, but his lack of plot relevance gives me nothing to latch onto in regard to his character other than that he is just a gruffer version of Larry. So, needless to say, I think that this episode still leaves plenty of room for improvement in that regard. However, one area where the original episode left very little room for improvement was with the production values, and they still tried to up the ante here. A 20-voice men's choir last time? How about 80 this time around? That, in addition to the orchestrated instrumentals, make this episode a true feast for the ears at points. And the visuals really pushed what the Fib already established, with Big Idea up to 60 employees at this point compared to fewer than 10 just a few years prior. This was meant to be the last VeggieTales episode before Jonah, and while the team wasn't ready to move on to the big screen just yet, this was the last episode to be animated in Softimage, with the team switching to Maya for the next episode. In that way, this episode truly was some kind of a peak for the team at Big Idea. However, this is where I have to say the effort does feel like it was wasted in a way. Despite the technical prowess on display, this episode does falter in the face of its predecessor when it comes to the atmosphere. Even putting my childhood fears aside, the episode could really feel eerie and grim at times, and this episode largely doesn't. Remember how I alluded to how the opening scene doesn't exactly set the tone for the episode? Well, that is because the very first scene is the only scene of the episode that doesn't take place in the daytime. Yup, everything else takes place when the sun's in the sky, albeit behind clouds at points, and it's really hard to build up a creepy atmosphere when the lights are on all the time. I guess the sewer might feel like a foreboding place the first time you watch the episode, but since, again, what Larry Boy does down there fails to contribute to the story in any meaningful way, whatever mood the sewer system tried to set up ultimately feels worthless in the end. But beyond that, the Fib was at his monstrous size for most of the story, while the mother weed doesn't explode into the town at her behemoth size until the climax. Seriously, the weed is defeated in just 3 minutes. And heck, even in that time span, nobody seems to be especially scared by the weed. The townsfolk all just seem content with Alfred getting what they think he deserves, and Alfred seems more annoyed than terrified while in the weed's grasp. Junior was in abject horror while in the Fib's clutches, and I would be too if I was in the grasp of a creature that smashed cars and climbed on top of a water tower. This episode can often feel like nothing is at stake for most of the runtime, both physically with limited town destruction and emotionally with rather subdued reactions to the monster. And considering that Larry Boy is meant to be a superhero created out of inspiration from Tim Burton's Batman, that does strike me as a little off-putting, I must admit. And that is Larry Boy and the Rumor Weed, and how it compares to Larry Boy and the Fib from Outer Space. I know that there are more smaller comparisons to be made, but I think I covered all of the important bases when diving into the weeds here. And yes, I have been waiting throughout this entire review to say that. But anyways, just like last time, this episode provided an entertaining watch, but as something meant to build off of the original, as most good sequels should try to do, this episode both succeeds, meets, and falls short of expectations. The villain and the messaging are greatly improved, the atmosphere falls a little flat, and Larry Boy's just as ineffective as ever. And for the record, this is in addition to the VeggieTales signature beats that I didn't mention in the review proper, like how the songs are great both in the episode and the credits, and how the comedy is still on point. Seriously, the Weed's first remark to Laura Carrot is still one of the funniest moments of the entire series in my opinion. Admittedly, while this episode is more kid-friendly as far as scares go, it might not be the best introduction to the series due to the lack of a silly song, the lack of countertop segments, and even a complete lack of anything featuring Bob the Tomato, and it's really hard to not take that personally. But if you do choose to start here for whatever reason, I don't think you will regret it, as this is, in fact, another fresh episode of the series. Even though I do think that this episode could have been better, it is nice to be fresh again after 2 rotten episodes. Will the next episode bring even more freshness? It will be a fresh start in a number of ways, in that it will air in a new decade and use new animation software, but will that bring a new layer of quality? Well, to be honest, those tidbits probably aren't as significant as the next episode's subject matter, but that is a topic for next time. This has been the 12th episode of every episode of VeggieTales Reviewed, where my goal is to review the entirety of the series designed to let everyone know that God made them special and he loves them very much. Tune in next time to hear me talk about episode 13, King George and the Ducky. Until then, thank you so much for watching, click the red button to subscribe, and have a fantastic rest of your day doing whatever.